if you're accepting us into seminary, if you're hiring us, you're placing us in churches, all of these things are demonstrating that you believe that women have a calling. And then you want to get to the point where you are acknowledging their gifts publicly, which is ordination. You stop short at that very point. There's a problem. You've already acknowledged our gifting. Why then stop short at a public declaration that God has given us a calling? It makes no sense to me.
Welcome back to Advent Next, a theological podcast curated for curious faith discussions. This week, we are opening up a riveting conversation with Pastor Danielle Pilgrim on female pastors, and we get to hear her story on why she rejected her commission. So let's start with a little background information. What does it mean to be commissioned? In the specific denomination, there was a vote back in 2015 by the General Conference Worldwide Church that stated women in pastoral ministries would not be allowed to be ordained like their male counterparts. This distinction came from the underlying fundamental belief that pastoral positions in their official capacity are set aside by God for men and not women. This ordination confers some extra authority within the church structure, such as the ability to baptize, in a way that is recognized as valid by the institution. I have a separate podcast on the history of ordination for those who want to learn more about this, but essentially when a woman becomes a pastor, she is not ordained by the church. Rather, she is commissioned. This is a title that essentially says we recognize the work you are doing, but we believe the authority associated with ordination, such as baptism, should be reserved for your male counterparts alone. I have a previous podcast that gets into this type of thinking in more detail, but this is a very simplified summary of the differences between ordination and commission, so you can understand what a commission is and why a woman would choose to reject it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic today, so listen close and let me know. But before we get started, I just want to thank the Adventist Learning Community for making this program possible. If you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, be sure to find us at the handle @AdventNext. You can follow our guest today, Pastor Danielle Pilgrim, on Instagram at Danielle_Pilgrim, and me at Kendra Arsenault with an X. But right now, this is Advent Next. So I just want to get right into the article that you wrote, and I some of the things that stood out to me, you begin this article, and I'm going to post it in the description of the channel, basically saying I'm not here to argue about the theological ramifications of this. I'm a woman in ministry. You obviously know where I lie. But you started talking about, you mentioned something that maybe we can explore a little bit more. But you said that in some ways, this idea of not ordaining women pastors that was passed in the GC in 2015, he says is contradictory because theoretically an ordained female elder has more authority than a commissioned or licensed female pastor. Break that down, because that's astonishing.
Yeah, the ordained female elder has about the same amount of leading power as a pastor. So in the presence of an ordained minister, an elder can baptize, they can lead communion, they can officiate, funerals, all of these things. So if an ordained elder, and the church has given the authority for women to be ordained, female elders to be ordained, then if you're ordaining elders who have the ability to perform these services and these ordinances, then to me it's contradictory that a woman in ministry cannot be ordained, you know what I mean? Because an elder holds that power, holds that weight. So to me, it doesn't make logical sense, right? If an elder can do these things, but a female elder, you're saying we're not going to ordain you to do these, it really doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, what's kind of the background before I jump into some of the more details? What was the inspiration for you writing this article? How did you get involved with this?
Sure. I was up for commissioning, and it called me to contemplate a lot about, the commissioning ceremony and why I was being offered commissioning and my counterparts were offered ordination, right? So in my conference, we're in my former conference, rather, we were in the Southern Union, and the Southern Union has not taken the step to ordain women. So the ordination services is very interesting. The program bulletin would say ordination and commissioning service. And it's like one service, but two separate services in that one service, because they have to make a distinction that the woman is being commissioned. And just thinking about that, and as I wrote in the article, the kind of glass ceiling that a woman in ministry has as pertains to working in our conferences and in our unions, it just did not sit right with me. And I understand the struggle that we're having, and a lot of it is a theological struggle. I get that. But for me, I felt like if I went along with being commissioned, that I would be saying that it's okay. I felt like I would be going along with where we are right now. And I feel like that will be contributing to the injustice that's happening. And so processing that for myself and the decision I had to make, this is where the article was birthed out of that that discussion I was having within myself. And so that's when the article, I came out with writing and publishing it.
And give us a little bit more background. I want to take a little more step back because, to be commissioned, you have to be in ministry for a while, right? And so what are your qualifications? What were your backgrounds? Like, what were all the ways that you were qualified as you were leading up to this, this moment where you are saying, I don't know if I want to be commissioned?
Right. So I was in ministry for about 4 years at the time, I believe. And I was associate pastor at Atlanta Berean Church, one of our very historical churches in our conference and in the entire union. I worked as associate pastor. I was in charge of discipleship, so new believers. I took them through the process, baptized several people myself. I was in charge of community engagement, so working with our community pantry and different organizations in the community, creating partnerships, doing programming in the summer for kids in the community. I was in charge of that. I was in charge of youth ministries, in charge of young adult ministries. For a period of time, I was basically leading the church for about 6 months because our senior pastor had left, and was able to do that. The conference president was the interim at the time, but he was so busy, I was doing a lot of the work. And so, he saw my work ethics and he always said, I don't have to worry because I know you got things under control. This is a, 2,000 member church in attendance, 4,000 members on the books. So it's a large church with a lot of responsibilities, and there's so many key elements. And I think I did fairly well with that church. So there were just so many areas that I covered. And, they saw my skills, they saw my passion, and, they decided that it was time, to acknowledge the gift that God had given me.
Wow. And so all of this is kind of leading up to this moment of saying, am I going to accept this? Am I not going to accept this? And even before, and I know I'm dramatizing this moment for a bit, but before we even get there, before that, what led you into ministry? Because at some level, I'm sure you knew kind of the church's stance on kind of women and pastoral leadership. And so I think for any woman in our church to continue to have their MDiv, to continue to pursue ministry, there has to be something greater, knowing that maybe the larger body is not even going to accept you once you do enter into that ministry.
Yeah. So great point that you bring out there. So what kind of halted me from even pursuing ministry when it first came to my thought, when I felt God had called me, was the fact that there was not a lot of examples in my former home conference in New York of women in ministry. So, I had never thought about it as an option to pursue full-time ministry because there wasn't a lot of examples. But, fast forwarding to when I felt called to it, I was listening to a sermon by Henry Wright, who was talking about spiritual gifts. And I think of pastoral ministry, chaplaincy as something that I've always been doing ever since I was baptized. It was something that was innate, trying to lead people to Christ, and doing service, right? That has always been a desire, passion of mine. I don't need to get paid for it. That is something I will do regardless, right? So going into ministry, then making that decision, and seeing that the church was a bit more open to it at the time, I came into it knowing that God had called me and no one was going to stop me, right? I wasn't hired by anyone. It wasn't, when I came to the seminary, I wasn't sponsored, but I knew God had called me. And it was just very evident in my life. So I was coming in thinking, if God called me, you're not going to stop me, right? But the idea that I have in my mind is if our GC, if our institution is opening doors for women to be in ministry, if you're accepting us into seminary, if you're hiring us, you're placing us in churches, all of these things are demonstrating that you believe that women have a calling. And then you want to get to the point where you are acknowledging their gifts publicly, which is ordination. You stop short at that very point. There's a problem. You've already acknowledged our gifting. Why then stop short at a public declaration that God has given us a calling? It makes no sense to me. And I think that for me, because I know some of my female colleagues, they accept commissioning, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Just for me, I know that change only comes when those who are being marginalized and oppressed start responding and kicking back towards a system that is putting up, that is creating the injustice, right? So for me, there was no way I can sleep at night knowing that I had accepted something that was a blatant disrespect and injustice. And that for me is where I had to draw the line. There's no reason for you to take my money, getting a degree, for you to hire me and then tell me this is where the buck ends with you. No, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen.
Right. Is there a point in time where before you came to the seminary that you also held the belief that women shouldn't be ordained? Or did you always feel no, I know that God's called me, and did you have that settled in your mind before you came, or was there a point in time where that shifted?
So that's a great question. This is a great question. I had a conversation with someone recently about this. I was taught that women should not be in leadership positions such as pastoral ministries. That's what I was taught, based on certain interpretations of Pauline writings. Well, when I came to seminary, right, and even before that, just realizing that there's context with certain, a lot of those scriptures that are, difficult for us to understand, some of us to understand. So I did have that ideology because that's what I was taught. But as I continued to read and to study and to listen to other individuals, realizing that interpretation wasn't correct, but also just the calling was just too strong for me to even continue to think that was a correct interpretation of the Bible. So I think it was the calling that caused me to rethink my beliefs. It was just too strong. And then, really understanding scripture and understanding how to interpret scripture later on opened up my eyes.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is that a lot of our church, believe that women should not be in ministry because they were taught that by men who interpreted the Bible. And now the church is understanding, well, maybe the way we read it was not right. Well, I think that the same men who taught women and men that women should not be in ministry, who are now understanding that maybe they were incorrect. They have the responsibility now to reteach those same congregations, the correct interpretation of scripture. And I think that that's where change comes, where we acknowledge that we have interpreted some things wrong. Because it makes no sense to say a woman can be, I'm sorry to go on a tangent, but it makes no sense to say that a woman can teach Sabbath school. A woman can do 65% of the church is a woman. Women are leading the charge. Then to say, you could do all these different things, but you cannot hold a position as pastor. And it really doesn't
Right.
make any sense. If you really think about it, it really doesn't make any sense.
Especially when you're at the seminary and you are with your female colleagues, and this is like, I'm gonna throw a little shade, but like not really. But then you see some of your other male counterparts and they're not performing as well, right? And it makes me think like, I know, how is this person who's like 4.0 excellent female leader, like not qualified in comparison to somebody just because of her gender, right? Like when you're behind the scenes and you're actually seeing the people who are stepping up to the plate to pastor our churches, it is kind of like I said, it doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make sense. I mean, and then you cannot deny the gifting.
Right.
You cannot deny the giftedness of the woman that you see. You just can't deny it. The largest church in our denomination is in China, led by a woman.
Mm.
Come on, she's bringing thousands and thousands of people to Christ. You can't deny that. You cannot say
Yeah.
that's not the Spirit of God. And so,
Yeah.
I think that we just need to we just need to open our eyes to what
And
God is.
I would definitely want to highlight something that you said because I related to it. Before I came here, I held some beliefs that I was like, I don't think, women should be ordained, but I'm not here to be ordained, right? Like I'm here to just here to do ministry. I'm just here to learn. And I think a lot of women kind of shrink their way into seminary. But you highlighted the fact that it didn't even seem like an option to you to enter into pastoral ministries because of the attitude of the church and also because the fact that there was a failure to have leaders who are also women, right? And it was a systemic failure, right? And to see like that there might be other women out there who are called and they're doubting their calling and they're not sure if they should move forward and they're dealing with guilt and shame all because of their gender. And that's just it's heartbreaking because we need more people in like it says the harvest is ready but the laborers are few, to really not bar anybody from coming. So I relate to that, and there was a moment that there was a switch and I was like, oh well, okay, let's do this. I'm gonna walk unashamed in this, right? So what I mean, where are you at now? So I mean, you did some pastoring out in Atlanta, and right now, what's your current situation?
Yeah. So was in Atlanta for 4 years, 4 great years of ministry. It really was. And now I am here at Andrews University. I am the associate chaplain here on campus. And it's just been really great. In addition to being chaplain, I'm also the lead pastor for New Life Fellowship, which is one of our fellowships here on campus. So that has been just awesome as well, even through a
Wow.
pandemic.
Wow. So, I mean, you're definitely qualified. You've kind of shown yourself in this regard. And I kind of want to, get back a little bit to the article because you highlight some other things that I want to talk about. But I just wanted to show like you are definitely doing your thing. You're definitely qualified. Oh wait, before we go back to the article, like, so the moment that you were coming up for your commissioning, what was that like? And like, did you decide? Like, when did you finally decide? Like, I'm not going to be commissioned. And were there people that were disappointed in you because of that? And like, how did you navigate that whole process?
Sure. So I made the decision. The conference had called me and told me that I was being considered for commissioning, and there's a process that you have to go through before you're actually commissioned or ordained. Um, and so I told them, thank you for thinking of me and so forth. And then I processed it for a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks. And then when I decided I wouldn't do it, then I asked my president if I could meet with him, and I met with him. I talked through, my processing, my thoughts, and where I stood. And surprisingly, he understood. He understood. Um, I was the second female in ministry in that conference, and I think with the first pastor, he learned a lot. So when it came to me, he was way more understanding. And so he understood, and I really appreciated him understanding. Now, there were some other people in the conference who did not like my decision. Some of them felt almost offended. And then there were, this is really interesting. I had posted this article online and I shared, I was up for commissioning. I rejected it. Here are my thoughts and why. And I got a lot of support, lot of, just people just applauding my decision. I did not do it for the, applause or anything like that. It was just my conviction. I'd have done it regardless. But there was one comment I will never forget, because this person is, they work for the NAD.
Okay.
The person is a female in ministry.
Yikes.
And her response was, I think this is very unprofessional. I think the GC is working on it, and it's going to change eventually, and so forth. And she went on, and I never responded because the thoughts that came to my head probably will not good for consumption. But that's one comment I'll never forget, because this was a fellow sister in ministry who is in a high position, and I said to myself, this is even more confirmation that I made the right decision, because it's the silence of others that cause injustice to continue.
Right.
And, to be in a position like the one that she's in, and to continue to just be silent about it and say, well, it will change eventually. Well, change does not come with compliance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Change comes the consistent bucking against the grain, because those in power do not readily give away power unless they are confronted.
Right.
And it's not to say that our church is power hungry, or the men in our church are power hungry. It's just that they have been comfortable with the way things are. And when women start talking about it, when women start responding to it, I think that more change will come.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question. It's Mental Health Awareness Month, and I'm curious, like, during this time, like, did this affect your mental health? And how did you kind of deal with that, if it did affect it? And do those types of sentiments, like, do you feel like it messes with the mental health of women?
I'm pretty sure it could affect the mental health of women, for sure. I think just overall, the commissioning of women, in my article, I said that, I quoted Martin Luther King Jr., who says, equality is not a matter of mathematics or geometry, but it's a matter of psychology. Where he's basically saying that equality is about telling someone that you matter, that your voice matter, that you are equal. And so for me, I think that commissioning just says to me that you're not equal. You are not on the same level as I am. That's what it says to me. And so I reject that wholeheartedly, which is why I will not accept it. However, I think with the comments that came after, it didn't affect me, because my calling is sure. Like, I am very confident that God has called me. My calling may look unique and a bit different than others, but I am very confident in what God has called me to. And so no words, will keep me down. Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, yeah. And I love this part of your article that says, there's no such thing as separate but equal. It's like, we've already been through this, right? Like, we've no such thing as separate but equal. And I want to read this quote that you did quote from Martin Luther King, because it's so beautiful. It says, equality is not only a matter of mathematics and geometry, but it's a matter of psychology. It's not only a quantitative something, but it's a qualitative something. And it's possible to have quantitative equality and qualitative inequality. And I think that really summarized some of the points that you're making, because when somebody says to you, well, women get paid the same as men, how would you respond to that?
In the past, I don't think that was the case. In the present now, I think that it is the case. However, with denying commissioning, I denied a little pay raise. So there's that. I will affirm that in our institution right now, as it pertains to pastors, we are being paid equally. But that does not deny the fact of the opportunities, the leadership opportunities that are not available, right? So in certain conferences and certain unions, women are not allowed to be presidents. They cannot, simply because of their gender. That's discrimination. that's injustice, right? So we have to acknowledge those things.
Yeah, yeah, and you really summarize this point of like a qualitative inequality, or a commission is a qualitative inequality, and it really is affecting it. Like I think you mentioned, like it affects how our churches see women in leadership. It affects that like their own ability to do their job, right? Have you come across that, and what ways is like kind of this belief affecting women's ability to do their jobs, maybe from experience of your colleagues or maybe a personal experience that you can bring to the table?
Sure. I had some colleagues. One, she went to a two-church district, and her church split when she arrived. Right,
Oh,
half of
wow.
the church left. Right, because she's a woman in ministry. The elders did not want to take, leadership from a woman in ministry. Right. So that has happened to several, I know, women pastors. In addition to, for my own experience, I was doing a baptism. I was, doing the charge. And while I was doing the charge, there was a man in the church who obviously had an issue with women in ministry. And I could see him get up from his seat, run to the front pew to talk to my senior pastor to tell him that I was not allowed to do that and I shouldn't be doing this. So I could see this happening while I'm doing the baptism. And when I was done, I came down to the front pew, and my senior pastor was ignoring him because it was an inappropriate time, right? You could have a concern, which is fine, but it's an inappropriate time. So he said, Danielle, can you just talk to him, please? I spoke to him. I said, I hear your concern. This is not the right time. We can talk to you after. And he said, don't talk to me. He said, I'm
Oh
not
my
listening
gosh.
to you. He said, I'm not listening to you. That again, the disrespect because of my gender and because of my position, it is that blatant disrespect that they feel okay. Some people feel okay that because they don't acknowledge my position, that they can disrespect you.
Mm.
Yeah, so those things are happening.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. I hope you were blessed by part 1 of this conversation with Pastor Danielle Pilgrim. Stay tuned for next week as we continue our talk and get some insight into how our theological bigotry is playing out in the next generation's desire to stay involved in the church. You can follow our guest today, Pastor Danielle Pilgrim, on Instagram at Danielle_Pilgrim, and me at Kendra R. Snow with an X. If you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, please be sure to do so at Advent Next. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next week.